Hello there, it's Mark from Our Magical Garden. So outside, the garden is currently locked in the quiet stasis of winter. But while the soil sleeps, history does not. And since we're indoors, I thought this is the perfect opportunity to turn our attention to a chapter of horticultural history that reads less like a gardening manual and more like an espionage thriller. I want to speak to you about the Victorian plant hunters. So to the modern eye, gardening is a peaceful domestic pursuit, but in the 19th century, botany was an arm of empire. It was a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess played by men who crossed oceans, donned disguises, scaled unmapped peaks, and engaged in what can only be described today as grand-scale industrial espionage. So just consider for a moment the contents of your own home. The tea steeping in your mug, the orchid sitting on your windowsill, the rhododendrons anchoring your local park. These are not native to our shores. They arrived here because individuals were willing to risk fever, imprisonment and shipwreck to acquire them. So settle in, make yourself a nice cup of tea, and let's travel back to the 1800s to an era of orchid delirium and imperial ambition. We begin with a man whose actions fundamentally altered the global economy, Robert Fortune. In the early 1840s, Fortune, a Scottish botanist, was commissioned by the Royal Horticultural Society to collect ornamental flowers in China. But in 1848, the East India Company made him a far more clandestine offer. They didn't want flowers, they wanted tea. At this time, China held a global monopoly on tea production. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for it, and the empire was desperate to cultivate its own supply in British-controlled India. Fortune's mission was explicit: infiltrate the forbidden interior of China, areas strictly off limits to foreigners, and steal the secrets of tea. Fortune's methods were pure theatre. He shaved the front of his head, wove a prosthetic queue into his remaining hair, and donned the silk robes of a mandarin. He travelled not as a Scotsman, but as a wealthy official from a distant province beyond the Great Wall, a clever ruse to explain his halting Mandarin. It was a perilous journey. In his journals, Fortune recounts fighting off river pirates on the Yangtze with a double-barrelled fowling piece, while his crew cowered below decks. But his most significant tool wasn't a gun. It was the Wardian case. These sealed glass terrariums allowed plants to survive the salt spray and fresh water rationing of a 6-month sea voyage. Fortune managed to smuggle over 20,000 tea plants and seeds out of China. But here's the nuance often missed in the history books. Many of those specific plants failed to thrive in the harsh heat of Assam. Fortune's true theft was intellectual. He brought back Chinese tea workers and the secrets of processing, specifically the revelation that black and green tea came from the same plant. He also revealed a scandal: that the green tea sold to Europe was often dyed with poisonous Prussian blue to make it look fresher. A bit of Victorian whistleblowing, if you will. But ultimately, the tea industry of India was built on the foundations of his audacity and his theft. If Fortune was the spy, our next figure was the titan of science, Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker, a close confidant of Charles Darwin and eventually the director of Kew Gardens. Hooker was a man of immense intellect and stamina. In 1847, he set his sights on the Himalayas, specifically the Kingdom of Sikkim, a gateway between India and Tibet. Hooker was chasing the rhododendron. While the species existed in Europe, they were nothing compared to the giants of the Himalayas. He spent years trekking through snow and leech-infested jungles, cataloguing over 7,000 species of plants. if you've ever stood in an English garden dwarfed by towering rhododendrons, you are likely looking at the lineage of Hooker's collection. But botany in this era was rarely distinct from politics. The local authorities viewed Hooker not just as a plant hunter, but as an agent of British expansion, which, in fairness, he was. And tensions boiled over. In 1849, Hooker and his companion, Dr. Archibald Campbell, were arrested by the Diwan of Sikkim. They were not merely detained, they were imprisoned, threatened with execution, and marched through the mountains as hostages. It sparked a massive diplomatic crisis. British troops were mobilised on the border, but eventually the Diwan capitulated and Hooker was released. He returned to England a hero, bringing with him the rhododendrons. But it serves as a stark reminder. These flowers were not just plucked from the ground. They were wrested from sovereign nations at gunpoint. So now we must address a phenomenon that gripped Victorian society with a force bordering on mania. They called it orchid delirium. To the Victorians, the orchid was the ultimate status symbol. It was exotic, impossible to propagate at the time, and notoriously difficult to keep alive. This scarcity drove prices to astronomical heights. A single rare specimen could sell for thousands of pounds in today's money. To feed this hunger, nurseries like Sanders of St Albans, known as the Orchid King, dispatched hunters to the Andes, the Amazon, and the jungles of New Guinea. These men were not scientists like Hooker. They were adventurers, often mercenaries. The competition was so fierce that stories abound of hunters finding a rare species and then burning the entire grove to the ground to ensure no rival could collect the same plant and lower the market price. It was an ecological tragedy. Thousands of trees were felled simply to strip the orchids from their branches. For every orchid that bloomed in a London drawing room, hundreds had rotted in the hold of a ship or been destroyed in the jungle. It was a trade fueled by beauty, yes, but also a rapacious consumerism that treated nature as a resource to be mined rather than stewarded. This era is so full of these stories that we could be here all day. But allow me to share 3 brief vignettes that illustrate the sheer madness of the time. So first of all, returning to Robert Fortune. During one expedition, fearing inspection by customs officials, he hid his most valuable seeds inside sealed chests marked private clothes and personal effects. So he effectively smuggled the foundations of an entire industry in his laundry. Joseph Hooker, despite his scholarly demeanour, was rugged. In the foothills of the Himalayas, he often travelled by elephant. Can you imagine trying to press delicate botanical specimens into a notebook while swaying on the back of a moving pachyderm? And there's a famous account of a nursery purchasing a ship's entire cargo of orchids while it was still at sea, sight unseen. And when the ship docked in London, the police had to be called to control the crowds. It wasn't a delivery, it was a botanical gold rush. So how do we reconcile this history? How do we look at our gardens today in light of these stories? It is a complex legacy. On one hand, the Victorian plant hunters expanded the Western world's botanical vocabulary more than any generation before or since. They gave us the genetic diversity that makes our modern gardens resilient and beautiful. We owe them our camellias, our clematis, our bleeding hearts. But we must also acknowledge the cost. Their work was inextricably tied to empire, to the appropriation of resources, and often to the destruction of the very environments they claimed to admire. It was an extraction of beauty, often without permission. To be a gardener today is to be a custodian of this history. When we plant a rhododendron or water an orchid, we are participating in a lineage that includes both the wonder of discovery and the scars of exploitation. I hope this journey into the misty, dangerous past adds a new layer of depth to your own winter planning. Next time you sip a cup of Earl Grey, perhaps offer a quiet nod to the pirates, the spies, and the scientists who made it possible. If you enjoyed this departure into the formal history of our craft, please let me know in the comments. There are many more stories to tell. Until next time, stay warm and happy gardening.